The day my father-in-law handed me a check for $500,000 and told me to disappear, I was sitting in the waiting room of the ICU, still wearing the same clothes I'd had on for 3 days straight. My dad had just been moved off the ventilator that morning. I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten anything real since Tuesday. And my father-in-law, this man who had stood next to me at my wedding and clinked his champagne glass against mine, sat down beside me in that sterile plastic chair, patted my knee like I was a coworker he was letting go, and slid a folded check across the armrest. "This is more than fair," he said. "You're a smart girl, Leigh. You know this marriage isn't working." I looked down at the check, $500,000. My name in the memo line, clean, neat handwriting. My dad was 20 feet away, hooked up to machines, and my husband's father was sitting next to me negotiating a buyout. I folded the check in half and put it in my coat pocket. I didn't say a word. He took that as progress. He had no idea what I actually did for a living. Let me back up, because the way I ended up in that waiting room, the way any of this happened, it didn't start with the check. It started 3 years earlier at a dinner party in Greenwich, where I met my husband Callum for the first time and made the mistake of being exactly the kind of woman his family never expected him to bring home. I'm a forensic accountant. I work with law firms and federal investigators to find money that people try to hide. Shell companies, layered LLCs, offshore accounts. I follow the paper trail until it runs out of places to go. It's not glamorous. Most of what I do is stare at spreadsheets for 12 hours and drink bad coffee. But I'm good at it. I've been doing it since I was 26, and by the time I met Callum, I had a reputation in a very specific, very quiet corner of the financial world that meant something. None of that mattered to the Alderton family. What mattered to them was that I grew up in a row house in South Philadelphia, that my dad drove a delivery truck, that I got my undergraduate degree from a state school on a combination of scholarships and student loans, that I didn't summer anywhere, that I couldn't tell a Brunello from a Barolo without reading the label, that when Callum's mother, Eleanor, asked which club my family belonged to, I genuinely didn't understand the question. She smiled at me that first night, a very practiced smile, the kind that doesn't move anything above the cheekbones. Callum was different, or I thought he was. He laughed at the right things. He asked real questions. He held my hand in the car on the way home and said, "I'm sorry about my mother. She's a lot." And I believed him because I wanted to, because he was kind to me in ways that felt true even when everything around us was telling me something different. We got married 18 months after that dinner party, in a venue his parents selected, with a guest list they mostly controlled, and a seating chart that put my Aunt Bonnie at a table near the kitchen. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I kept noticing and kept not saying anything for the better part of 2 years. His father, Warren, ran the family's real estate development company. It had been started by Callum's grandfather and had grown into something significant: commercial properties across the Northeast, some residential, a portfolio that touched basically every county in Connecticut, and a good chunk of Massachusetts. Warren controlled the majority stake. Callum was being groomed to take over, which meant Callum was permanently, structurally dependent on his father's approval in a way that I don't think either of them fully recognized. That dependency was the fault line in our marriage. I just didn't see it clearly until the fault line cracked open. We'd been trying to have a baby for about 8 months when my dad had his first cardiac event. It wasn't the one that put him in the ICU, they came later, but it was serious enough to send him to the hospital for 5 days and send me to Philadelphia for 2 weeks to help my mom manage everything. Callum came for the first weekend. He had a board meeting on Monday, then a site visit on Wednesday, then something else on Friday. Each thing was legitimate. Each thing was real. But the accumulation of real things meant that my husband was not there, and I was alone in my childhood bedroom crying at 2 in the morning because I didn't know if my dad was going to be okay, and my phone had gone quiet. I don't think Callum meant to become distant. I think he genuinely didn't know how to exist in a world that wasn't curated and comfortable. I think he'd been raised in a family where difficulty was managed, not felt, and he had never developed the reflex for sitting with someone in their pain without trying to solve it or schedule around it. But here's the thing about being a forensic accountant. I'm trained to look at patterns over time, not individual transactions. One missed call is nothing. A month of missed calls is data. By the time my dad stabilized and I came home, something had shifted. I could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Callum was present but somewhere else. He'd come to bed late, he'd leave early. He started taking calls in his home office with the door shut, which he'd never done before. I didn't go looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not the kind of person who goes through someone's phone, but I am the kind of person who notices when a number shows up on a joint credit card statement under a restaurant we've never been to together, 4 times in 6 weeks, always on a Tuesday. I noted it. I kept watching. The second cardiac event happened in November. My dad collapsed in the garage. My mom called me from the ambulance, and I remember standing in my kitchen, coat half on, car keys already in my hand, and Callum coming downstairs and saying he had to be in Hartford the next morning for something that couldn't move. He said it carefully, the way you say something you've rehearsed. He said he'd come as soon as he could. He came 4 days later. My dad was in the ICU by then. The doctors were talking about a procedure that might help, and a long recovery either way, and my mom was barely eating and my brother was flying in from Denver, and I was holding everything together with both hands and no sleep, and approximately 0 emotional support from the man I was married to. That was when Warren sat down next to me in the waiting room with the check. I think he expected one of 2 reactions. Either I'd cry and be grateful, or I'd get angry and he could dismiss me as unstable. He'd clearly done this calculation. $500,000 is a very precise number. High enough to feel serious. Low enough that he could deny it was a real offer if anyone ever asked. I recognized the structure immediately. It's the kind of number you put in a non-disclosure agreement when you want to make a problem go away without creating a paper trail that looks like you tried to make a problem go away. I folded it in half and put it in my pocket. That night in the parking garage outside the hospital, I sat in my car for a long time, not crying, just thinking. I've learned over the years that the best thinking I do happens in parking garages and laundromats and other places where there's nothing pretty to look at. I thought about what I knew. I thought about what I could find out. I thought about the difference between those 2 things and how the distance between them is where I've always done my best work. Then I called my college roommate Petra, who is a family law attorney in Boston, and I said, I need to understand something. We talked for 2 hours. Here's what I found out over the next 6 weeks. Working from my laptop in my parents' living room while my dad did cardiac rehab 3 mornings a week, and my mom made soup she kept saying wasn't for me, but always left a bowl by my computer. The Alderton Family Trust, the one that controlled the majority of the real estate portfolio, had a clause. A fairly standard clause in old money family documents. In the event of divorce, any shares held by a married-in family member reverted to the trust. What was not standard was a second clause, added in a codicil about 12 years ago, that tied Callum's ownership stake to continued active participation in family enterprise, a phrase vague enough to mean whatever Warren decided it meant on any given day. I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to read financial documents, and I know what it looks like when someone has constructed a system designed to keep another person permanently controllable. Callum didn't own anything, really. He managed things. He had the title and the business cards and the company car and the Greenwich house that was technically in the trust's name. He had the appearance of wealth and the substance of dependency. And Warren had spent decades building that arrangement carefully, brick by brick, in the language of estate planning and corporate governance. I also found out, through a contact of mine who does due diligence work for a private equity firm that had been sniffing around some of the Alderton properties, that 2 of the commercial developments currently under Warren's management were significantly over-leveraged. The debt-to-equity ratio on the Providence properties in particular was the kind of number that keeps CFOs up at night. They'd been rolling short-term loans for about 18 months, and the interest environment was not being kind to that strategy. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't angry. I was furious, actually, in the specific way you get furious when you realize that someone has been calculating around you for a long time and thought they could get away with it because you seemed too busy, or too soft, or too grateful to look closely. But I've learned, over the course of my career, that anger is useful in small doses and dangerous in large ones. What you want to do with anger is convert it into focus. So I focused. I went back to Greenwich at the end of November. I unpacked my bag. I made coffee. I smiled at Callum when he came downstairs and said I'd missed him, which was true and not true at the same time in the way that complicated things often are. He looked relieved. He'd been braced for something, I think, and when I didn't deliver it, he exhaled. That was fine. I needed him exhaled. I hired a private investigator 2 weeks later, a woman named Gail who I'd worked with on a case 3 years earlier and who was, without question, the least dramatic person I've ever met, which is exactly what you want. I told her what I needed and approximately how long I thought it would take, and she told me her rate and said she'd check in every Friday. She checked in every Friday for 6 weeks. What she found wasn't a surprise, exactly. It was a confirmation. Callum had been seeing someone, a woman who worked in marketing for one of the Alderton properties, a position she'd held for about 8 months, which is roughly when the Tuesday restaurant charges started appearing on her statement. I won't describe her beyond that because she's a private person and this isn't her story, and honestly, she was probably told things that weren't true, the way people in those situations often are. What mattered to me was not the fact of it. What mattered was the documentation, because documentation is what you use when you want to make something real in the eyes of people who only believe what's in writing. I talked to Petra again. Long conversation, very practical. We talked about equitable distribution. We talked about my career income versus Callum's compensation structure. We talked about the Greenwich house and what it would mean that it was technically trust property. We talked about timing. Petra said, "You could do this now, or you could wait." I said, "What does waiting get me?" She thought about it. "It depends on what you know that I don't." So I told her about the Providence properties, about the leverage ratio, about the short-term loans rolling into an unfriendly rate environment. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, we wait." I want to tell you about my dad for a second, because he matters here and not just as a plot point. My dad is the kind of man who fixed things, not metaphorically, literally. He could fix a furnace, a car engine, a leaking pipe, a broken porch step. He had a garage full of tools that were organized in a system only he understood, and he could reach for something in the dark and his hand would land exactly where it needed to be. He worked hard his whole life and never complained about it and never asked anyone to notice. When I was 14, I found a box in the attic with every single report card I'd ever gotten, starting from kindergarten. He'd kept all of them. He'd kept my honor roll certificates and my spelling bee ribbons, and a drawing I did in 2nd grade of our house with a sun in the corner and a cat on the lawn even though we never had a cat. He never told me he was proud of me in those words exactly, but he drove 4 hours each way to every parent weekend I had in college. He bought a new suit for my first job interview and said he'd worn it for luck, even though I'm pretty sure he just wore it because he wanted to celebrate with me. He walked me down the aisle at my wedding with his back straight and his eyes wet, and he shook Callum's hand like he was handing over something precious. I thought about all of this while I was watching him learn to walk upstairs again after his procedure. I thought about it while he was making slow loops around the neighborhood, my mom at his side, his breath visible in the cold air. I thought, I am not going to let this be the year that everything falls apart, not while he's working this hard to stay in it. That helped me stay patient. The Providence properties started showing stress in February. My contact at the PE firm mentioned it in passing, the way people mention things when they trust you and aren't thinking about whether they should. The refinancing wasn't coming together the way Warren had expected. The lender was getting careful. There were conversations happening that weren't in the press releases. I told Petra. She said, "Now?" I said, "Now." I filed in March. Callum got the papers at his office, which Petra recommended for logistical reasons and which I agreed to despite the fact that I knew it would feel aggressive, because some things need to feel like what they are. He called me 20 minutes after the courier delivered them. His voice was very controlled in the way that means someone is actively controlling it. He said, "We should talk about this." I said, "We should. Have your attorney call Petra." Then I waited for Warren to call because I knew he would. He called the next morning early before I'd finished my coffee. He said he thought we could work this out between the families. He used that phrase twice, between the families, as if I were a territory to be negotiated over rather than a person with rights and a forensic accountant's understanding of exactly what those rights were worth. I said, "Warren, please have your attorney call Petra." He paused. Then he said, "That check is off the table." "I know," I said. "I never deposited it." I still had it, actually. I kept it in a fireproof lockbox in my home office, along with a written account of the conversation in the waiting room that I'd typed up that same night from memory, dated and time-stamped. I'd been keeping notes since November, dates, times, direct quotes where I could remember them, characterizations where I couldn't. The offer of money to a spouse during a divorce, in the context of a pending legal proceeding, creates a very specific kind of legal problem. Petra explained it to me in terms I won't repeat here, but the upshot was, it was useful. The discovery process is where my professional life intersects with my personal life in ways that Warren clearly had not anticipated. When you're a forensic accountant in a divorce proceeding, you know exactly what to ask for and exactly how to read what you get. Petra knew this. She also knew several colleagues who specialized in matrimonial litigation and had worked with financial forensics experts before. We put together a very specific set of document requests. What came back, over 6 weeks of back and forth, confirmed most of what I already suspected and added a few things I hadn't known. The Providence situation was worse than my contact had indicated. There were personal guarantees. Warren had personally guaranteed 2 of the loans, which meant his liability extended beyond the corporate entities. Callum had been copied on several internal memos about the financing problems, which meant his claimed ignorance was difficult to sustain. More importantly, the codicil and the trust that tied Callum's stake to active participation in family enterprise had been amended 18 months ago. The amendment added specific language about maintaining the properties at or above certain valuation benchmarks. The Providence properties were not meeting those benchmarks. Technically, under the amended language, Callum's stake was already in question, not because of the divorce, but because of the portfolio performance. I want to be honest, I didn't ruin the Alderton family. They were already in the process of doing that themselves. The leverage was theirs. The guarantees were Warren's decisions. The performance problems existed before I filed, before I hired Gail, before I sat in that parking garage and decided to pay attention. What I did was pay attention carefully over a long period of time and make sure that when the reckoning came, I was not standing in the blast radius. The settlement took 4 months to negotiate. I'm not going to give you the number because it's not the number that matters. What I'll tell you is that it reflected the actual value of what I was entitled to, not the managed, minimized version that Warren had calculated when he sat down next to me in a hospital waiting room and decided I could be handled. The Greenwich house went back to the trust, which was fine. I didn't want it. I found an apartment in Philadelphia, 10 minutes from my parents, which was what I actually wanted and had been pretending for 2 years that I didn't. There's one more thing I want to tell you because it matters, and because I think it's the part of this kind of story that usually gets left out. Callum's sister, Audra, and I want to say clearly that she had nothing to do with any of it. She texted me the week after the settlement finalized. She said she was sorry. She said she'd known for a while that things were wrong and she hadn't known what to do about it. She said our friendship, such as it was, had meant something real to her even when everything around it was complicated. I wrote back. I said I appreciated her saying that. I said I hoped she was doing okay. She said, "I always thought you were the best thing that ever happened to this family. I'm sorry they didn't know what to do with that." I sat with that for a long time. I'm not someone who comes easily to forgiveness, and I'm not going to tell you that I've forgiven everyone involved, because I haven't fully, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But I've learned, in the years since, that the story doesn't end at the settlement. The story keeps going, and what you do with it after the crisis is over turns out to matter as much as what you did during it. My dad came to help me move into the new apartment. He carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs without being asked, and when we were done, he stood in the middle of my living room with his hands on his hips, looking around, and he said, "I like this place." I said, "Yeah?" He said, "Yeah, it looks like you." And that was enough. That was exactly enough. I work for myself now, my own firm, 2 associates, a client list that keeps me busy and interested. I live 10 minutes from my parents. I have a dog. I sleep well. I'm not telling you this story because I want you to feel sorry for me, or because I want you to be angry at the Aldertons, or because I think there's some clean lesson to extract from it and put in your pocket. I'm telling you because I spent a lot of time in the middle of all of it feeling like I was the only person this had ever happened to. Like the specific combination of circumstances, the money, the family, the waiting room, the check, was too strange and too particular to have happened to anyone else. But it wasn't. It happens in 100 different forms to people who are told, one way or another, that they can be managed, that they have a price, that the smart thing to do is take what's offered and be quiet about it. I just happen to know how to read the balance sheet. I still think about that parking garage sometimes. The fluorescent lights, the smell of concrete and exhaust. The way I sat there for a long time without crying, which surprised me, because I'm not someone who doesn't cry. I just had nothing left that wanted to come out that way. What I had instead was something quieter and more useful, a kind of clarity that only shows up after you've been insulted so specifically that it removes all your remaining doubts about what you need to do next. Warren thought he was offering me a way out. What he was actually doing was showing me exactly what he thought I was worth, which told me everything I needed to know about how the next chapter had to go. I've thought a lot about why it worked out the way it did, not in a self-congratulatory way. I made plenty of mistakes in that marriage, and I'm honest with myself about that. But I think there's something real in the fact that what ultimately protected me wasn't luck, and it wasn't connections, and it wasn't money. It was that I'd spent years building a set of skills rooted in honesty. Forensic accounting, at its core, is about telling the truth about numbers when powerful people want those numbers to stay hidden. You can't do that work and simultaneously deceive yourself about what you're looking at in your own life. The discipline carries over. I think that matters. There's a kind of integrity that isn't about being perfect or being the hero of your own story. It's about refusing to look away from what's true, even when looking away would be more comfortable. I looked away from things in my marriage for longer than I should have, but when I really stopped, I didn't flinch. That's what I'm most proud of. Not the settlement, not the outcome, but the moment in the car when I decided to see things clearly and act accordingly. And then there's what my dad showed me, just by existing. He's not a man who talks about resilience. He just has it, the way some people carry a particular quality so naturally that they don't have a name for it. He carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs 6 months after a cardiac procedure without being asked and without making it mean anything. That's the version of strength I want. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet, showing up kind that doesn't need an audience. I think what gets people into situations like the one I was in isn't weakness exactly. It's the slow erosion that happens when you keep absorbing small things without naming them. The seating chart at the wedding, the missed calls from the hospital, the check on the armrest. Each one feels survivable on its own. The pattern is what costs you. But patterns can be read if you're willing to read them. That's true in financial documents, and it's true in the texture of a relationship, and it's true in your own life, if you can get still enough to look. I live 10 minutes from my parents now. I have a dog who sleeps at the foot of my bed, and a client list that keeps me interested in a life that, on most mornings, feels genuinely like mine. I didn't get here by being ruthless. I got here by being honest, by thinking carefully, and by deciding, in a fluorescent-lit parking garage on a cold November night, that I wasn't going to let someone else write the ending.